In 2028, director Sam Mendes is set to release an enormous biopic project centered around the Beatles. The project will, apparently, see not one, but 4 different biopics, each telling the Beatles' story from the perspective of a different member of the band. It's a hugely ambitious project that's sure to stir up controversy, garner awards buzz, and perform at the box office. And I think it's a sign that we are fast hurtling toward the zenith of the music biopic era. Filmmakers have been interpreting musicians' lives for decades now, but in recent years there's been a rise both in the frequency of these films and the profile of the artists featured. In the wake of successes like Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocketman, we've seen high-budget, estate-sanctioned biopics from musical giants like Aretha Franklin, Elvis, Bob Marley, Bob Dylan, and even Weird Al. Later this year, we're getting biopics on Michael Jackson and Bruce Springsteen, and apparently there's films in the work right now about Madonna, Keith Moon, Billy Joel. Martin Scorsese's even been in talks to develop a Frank Sinatra biopic. But for all the financial success of these projects, many of them are met with middling reviews and leave little to no lasting impact on culture. You know, they'll dominate the entertainment news cycle for a few weeks at a time, you'll get a resurgence of buzz at award season, and then they kind of disappear from the collective memory. And this reality begs the question that I want to explore in this video. What's the point of music biopics? Now, there is one very obvious point to all of these biopics.
Money, please.
When you create a film based on an artist who is already beloved by millions, who's already sold millions of records, you're tapping into a bankable audience. An audience that's proved they're willing to spend money to support this artist. In an era when movie studios are all about safe bets, and many one-time safe bets have been flopping, music biopics are a natural investment that almost always pay back, and often pay out to pretty absurd degrees. But surely that can't be the only reason why these films exist. Call me a romantic, but I actually like to believe that art serves a purpose beyond padding the pockets of businessmen and investors. Even the most cynical cash grabs necessarily have some amount of passion and pride put into them. People make art because they want to say something, even if the art doesn't always succeed in doing that. For me, the problem with so many of these biopics is that they feel pointless. Or maybe pointless is too harsh. There are definitely some fun aspects to even the most formulaic of these biopics. These movies, especially the big budget ones, tend to be marvelous exercises in production design. They're a testament to the incredible work of costume designers, set designers, makeup artists, location scouts, and the myriad people behind the scenes that make movie magic happen. There's something uniquely special about seeing an iconic outfit that you've seen photos of come to life in vivid Technicolor, or being able to immerse yourself in a famous concert that you've only ever seen grainy, low-res video of. These films can also serve as a showpiece for actors, allowing them to inhabit people that we already know and love. If an actor does this successfully, they can even add a new dimension to the character that might shift how we think of our favorite pop stars, or how we remember their impact on the world. And of course, these performances are often used for awards bait. This kind of award buzz and historical photo comparison is fun, but really these are surface level satisfactions. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I didn't set out to make this video so I could talk about Rami Malek's prosthetics or Timothée Chalamet's mastery of the nasal mumble. When I decided to make this video, I did so hoping to find a deeper and more lasting purpose to the music biopic, and hoping I could figure out where they fit in our cultural landscape. So over the past few weeks, I've been watching as many music biopics as I can get my hands on. And I'm gonna be honest with you, this whole process has been a little mind-melting. I've seen so many press conferences, tour montages, Suge Knight shenanigans, and there's been some weird turns. You know, I watched Paul Giamatti become Brian Wilson's sleazy therapist and NWA's manager back-to-back, which means absolutely nothing, but it was a weird experience that I wanted to mention somewhere. With that being said, let's look at some of the purposes that I think music biopics might serve. The stated reason for a lot of these biopics is simply to tell the story of figures who have touched a lot of people's lives. And that's what a lot of these big budget prestige biopics do. Kinda, I guess. Films like Ray, Walk the Line, Notorious, All Eyes on Me, or even Rocketman follow their heroes from childhood trauma to the twilight of their careers, or to their tragic deaths. Biopics based on group acts will tend to start a little later, but the arc is generally about the same. While I guess this is a justifiable purpose, I don't think it's a coincidence that these life-spanning biopics tend to be the ones that fall flat and wind up pretty forgettable. A criticism often levied at these type of films is that they feel like Wikipedia articles. Personally, I don't think that's fair, because Wikipedia articles tend to put a lot of thought and effort into telling the truth. Meanwhile, far too many of these prestige, life-spanning biopics play pretty fast and loose with real events. Now, to be clear, as we'll see later in this video, I'm not against biopics that play with the truth a little. There's always going to be bits of creative liberty that need to be taken with any story, and even more fact-based forms of storytelling like biography and documentary will sometimes fill in the blank spots with speculation or with a bit of made-up color. But a lot of these biopics sell themselves as the true story, only to turn around and fill their plot with massive omissions, egregious shifts in timeline, and things that are sometimes just made up. Walk the Line exaggerates the tension between Johnny Cash and his father to create more drama and underline the film's themes. Straight Outta Compton basically erases Arabian Prince, a founding member of NWA, underplays the role of MC Ren, and completely leaves anything out about Dr. Dre's abuses. And then there's Bohemian Rhapsody, which completely changes timelines, adds an implied breakup that never happened, and most egregiously, changes the entirety of the facts with Freddie Mercury's AIDS diagnosis. All this is done in service of squeezing Queen's life into a formulaic narrative of the rock star. These kinds of inaccuracies make it really hard to believe that the purpose of biopics is really to tell the true stories. Instead, I think that a lot of these films are rewriting history to turn it into myth. Human beings are natural storytellers. We've always used story and myth as ways to teach lessons, explain the world, and to understand our part within it. And these stories inevitably have a way of growing in the telling. Story transmutes living, breathing people into symbols of a culture's values, heroes to be worshipped, villains to be despised, or cautionary tales to reflect upon. This mythologizing is really what most music biopics are doing to their subject, and it's why so many of them follow the same familiar structure, which I'm going to refer to from here on out as the Dewey Cox arc. If you want a more in-depth look at the Dewey Cox arc, you should check out Patrick Williams' fantastic video on the topic. But in short, this arc follows a talented child who grows up with a fraught relationship with their parents, defies the odd to find fame, finds time to squeeze in a few cameos from other famous musicians, tours the world in a stylized montage, spirals out into addiction, alienates everyone they love, and eventually overcomes their demons to get a happy ending. These commonalities form the archetypal rock star life, which serves as a reflection of the values and concerns of our era. Pop star stories become mythic parables for an age of industry and excess. Instead of our heroes facing off against giants and witches, they have to deal with sleazy managers and the toxic music press. The demons they battle are vanity, pride, and most frequently, addiction. And in the end, our heroes either arise triumphant and forever changed, or meet the tragic end of a martyr. I think most biopics engage in this sort of mythologizing to some degree or another, even those that don't follow the Dewey Cox arc. One of the stronger films in the recent slew of prestige biopics is A Complete Unknown, which brings to life the most mythologized era of Dylan's career. But despite a name that suggests it might be exploring Dylan's figure deeper, the movie plays things pretty straight, telling the story of Dylan going electric pretty much the same way it's always been told. It does make a few efforts to explore Dylan's complicated relationships to the women in his life, and it does a great job of highlighting the Greenwich scene in general, and especially the importance of Joan Baez. But on the whole, it's a pretty straightforward telling of a moment that's been immortalized in myth for half a century now. Make no mistake, I did love this movie a lot, and I thought it did a good job of showing a new audience why Dylan is so important. But at the end of the day, it falls into the pretty standard myth-making that all these films do. This kind of storytelling and history tweaking is especially prevalent in films that are being made with the direct involvement of their subjects. You can see it in Straight Outta Compton, where the story of NWA is rewritten to mostly be about the importance of Ice Cube and Dr. Dre, who produced the movie. Bohemian Rhapsody depicts the living members of Queen who produced the film as the straight-laced foils to Freddie Mercury's larger-than-life persona. As rock stars are reaching their twilight years, many of them are looking for one more way to exert their influence on their own myth and to seek immortality. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because performers are in the business of self-mythologizing. Most of the artists we see profiled in these films take on new names and new personas en route to fame, tearing down their original identities and creating a mythology around themselves. And I think the most successful biopics are the ones that embrace this reality, both in content and in form. Todd Haynes' I'm Not There is an experimental biopic that tells the story of Bob Dylan through 6 different characters, each representing the different personas Dylan has embodied throughout his career. It's a film that understands Dylan's role within the complex cultural history of his own country and uses him as a symbol to explore that history. And it's a film that I'm going to talk about a lot in this video because I think it's probably my favorite biopic ever made. But first, I want to look at 2 more biopics that I think were successful because of the way they embraced heightened realities. Rocket Man is, in many ways, the conventional musical biopic. Its plot follows the Dewey Cox arc to a T, but it doesn't feel stale or trite in the way Bohemian Rhapsody does. And that's because it accepts the fact that it's mythology. It leans into the fiction of it all by telling the story as a grand, over-the-top musical. The medium of musical theater always operates in a heightened reality, underlining emotional stakes with more abstract, fantastical sequences. By fully embracing this, Rocket Man manages to breathe fresh air into the familiar old beats of our rock star's journey. The section where Elton John experiences glitz and glamour is an old Hollywood-style musical number. And as a side note here, it's cut from the original film, but the video of this song on YouTube has a full Busby Berkeley-inspired section where a bunch of buff men tap dance in their underwear on top of a golden record, and by God, that should have made the final cut of the film. There's so many other sequences like this. The trope of pop star going from overdosing to being propped up on stage is executed with beautiful style in Rocket Man. Elton John's spiraling out is made literal in Pinball Wizard. And then there's the peak of hedonism when Benny and the Jets descends into a dark house track as Taron Egerton body surfs on top of an orgy. The success that Rocket Man found with this approach was no doubt an influence on another surreal, larger-than-life musical biopic released last year, Better Man, or as I've been calling it, that Robbie Williams chimp movie, is a completely unhinged musical biopic directed by Michael Gracie. Like Rocket Man, it follows the Dewey Cox arc pretty closely, but it leans into the legend of it all, turning Robbie Williams into a literal dancing monkey. There are some stunning sequences throughout the film, but the mythologizing comes to its peak at the climax, which reenacts Williams' 2003 performance at Nebworth. That sequence opens with Robbie Williams descending from the sky in an upside-down crucifix pose, a literal reenactment of something that actually happened. As the performance goes on, it becomes more and more fantastical until, and I promise you, this is a thing that actually happens, Robbie Williams dives into the crowd, starts fighting alternate chimp versions of himself, including a flayed monkey with a giant flail, murders his inner child, and turns the Nebworth grounds into an apocalyptic ruin. It's honestly one of the most metal things I've ever seen, and it is nothing if not mythic. By actively engaging with their mythic nature, fantastical biopics like I'm Not There, Rocket Man, and Better Man set themselves apart from their contemporaries, while still largely serving the same place within the culture. But not every biopic is interested in doing this kind of mythologizing. In fact, there are some that engage in the exact opposite. One of the most maligned biopics in recent years is Gabriel Range's 2020 film Stardust. That movie follows a young David Bowie on an ill-fated publicity tour in 1971 as he tries to break it into the States. A tour that will ultimately help inspire his Ziggy Stardust character. It portrays Bowie not as a mythic changeling from outer space, but rather as an insecure 20-something who's on the cusp of fame but can't quite seem to find it. I think this depiction rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because people want their biopics to reinforce the legends they've heard, but honestly, I quite enjoyed it. It was refreshing to see a movie that was actively trying to remind us that rock stars are real people whose lives are sometimes fraught with pretty mundane problems. In particular, I thought the movie did an interesting job showing how alienating 70s America would be for a flamboyant queer British musician like Bowie, and how that alienation might have helped to inspire Ziggy Stardust. Now, I don't think this was a great movie. It had some serious problems, especially when it came to its treatment of mental illness, and the fact that they couldn't license any Bowie songs for the film really hurt it. But still, it was refreshing to see a biopic that humanized a rock star amidst a sea of deifying movies. And besides, there's already a great movie that leans into the Bowie myth in Todd Haynes' Velvet Goldmine. That one's not exactly a biopic, but also it kinda is. Really it falls into this weird category of biopics that use fictional musicians to evoke real musicians or real music scenes, things like 8 Mile or Inside Llewyn Davis. There's a lot of these out there, and I've got thoughts on them, but those are maybe topics for another video. Another film that deconstructs the myth of the rock star is Sofia Coppola's Priscilla. This is a particularly interesting example because it was released right next to Baz Luhrmann's Elvis, which is absolutely a mythic biopic. While Luhrmann's movie makes Elvis into this larger-than-life figure, Priscilla breaks down the myth of Elvis not by looking at the rock star himself, but by looking at the tragic life of his wife Priscilla. Many of the biggest and most successful biopics center themselves around male stars, while the women in their lives are reduced to simple tropes: distant mothers, interchangeable groupies, tormented wives. Some films, like Straight Outta Compton, completely leave out their subjects' histories of abuse. But Priscilla is an unflinching character study of a woman who started dating Elvis when she was just 14. It shows the impact that his fame, drug use, and adultery have on her, and in doing so, reminds us of the impact that these mythic rock stars have on the real, actual people around them. In that way, I think it does a great job of demythologizing the rock star. But not everything that challenges myth needs to be so dark and serious. One of the most unique biopics I watched in this entire project is one that's explicitly interested in exploring and subverting the urban legends around rock stars. 24-Hour Party People is a biopic about Tony Wilson and the evolution of Manchester's music scene. It follows Wilson and the rise of factory records from the punk era of the late 70s through the birth of rave culture all the way to the demise of factory records. You can tell even just by looking at this film that it's not your average biopic. Rather than the crisp, dramatic sheen we're used to, 24-Hour Party People is shot with a grainy, cinema verite quality. But this gritty, fly-on-the-wall feel is contrasted by the film's overt acceptance of fantasy. Steve Coogan, who plays Tony Wilson, is frequently breaking the fourth wall to cast doubt on events and poke fun at the ways these stories are told. There's fantastical sequences including a UFO landing and a vision from God, and the whole plot of the movie kind of ambles along in this loose, kind of stilted way. It's thoroughly unglamorous, deeply unserious, and a really fantastic reminder of the messy humanity at the core of any great musical movement. And personally, I wish more biopics like 24-Hour Party People existed. It's really fun to see these figures that we see as mythical gods reduced to a bunch of blokes smoking cigarettes in a shitty studio. There's one more film that I think does a bit of demythologizing even as it's building myth, and that's I'm Not There. Now, I know I just ranted about how good this film was at embodying the Dylan myth, but hey, humans contain multitudes, and Dylan especially contains multitudes. There's one particular plot in I'm Not There that I think does a masterful job at picking apart the myth of Dylan. This plot sees Heath Ledger playing the role of a successful actor caught in a tumultuous marriage that plays out along the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Bear with me for a minute because this might get a little confusing. In the film, Heath Ledger's character got famous for a biopic portrayal of Jack Rollins, another Dylan stand-in played by Christian Bale. Bale's character is a pretty straightforward depiction of protest-era Dylan, who calls truth to power and gets reluctantly named the voice of his generation before disappearing off the map. So to reiterate, Heath Ledger is playing a version of Bob Dylan, who is an actor who got famous for playing another version of Bob Dylan. I think of any portrayal of Dylan I've seen, this one might be the most honest, and it's certainly the most critical. Ledger's character is a pretty vapid chauvinist who varies greatly from the character that he's known for playing. His sections are far and away the most grounded of the film, serving as a character study of a couple caught in a romance that's ultimately doomed by fame. I think this kind of meta-commentary, the strange cyclical reality of an actor playing a character who's an actor who played a character who's a musician who's based on a real musician who played characters, challenges the mythology of the rock star by drawing direct attention to the artifice of it all. To attempt this demythologizing while actively mythologizing in other sections of the film is such a quintessentially Dylan thing to do, which brings us to another purpose of biopics: celebrating and embodying the music that we love. This is another pretty obvious purpose for a biopic. This music is beloved by millions, why not celebrate it with film? And this is definitely a valuable and noble cause. The only problem is that most biopics choose to celebrate the music by having someone who kinda looks like the artist sing less good versions of the song while recreating iconic concert moments. Now, I do enjoy the needle drops, even in the laziest of these biopics. Often they're the best parts of the movie. But I also don't really need a dramatic shot of a Biggie Smalls lookalike in the booth to appreciate Juicy. I can just listen to Juicy. All too often, these movies are just populated with scenes of actors sitting around in studios or semi-stylized montages of them on tour playing. And these are fun, but they're not really living up to the potential of the medium. Film is a medium that is so powerful, both visually and narratively. And using that can really celebrate these beloved songs by bringing new life and color to them. This is a big reason why Rocket Man and Better Man work so well. Their musical sections are larger than life. They embody the feeling that you get from listening to these songs, rather than just trying to replicate the song and the artist themselves. I think Elvis does a great job with this as well. All of Baz Luhrmann's musical sequences are so over the top in their shooting. They're filled with rapid cuts and tight close-ups on Elvis. They've got the fast pace, raw energy, and unchained sexuality of Elvis's music. Another film that I thought did a fun job with this was Piece by Piece, the 2024 Lego movie about Pharrell Williams. I haven't talked about this one as much because it's kinda actually more of a documentary than a biopic, but its visual language kind of blurs the line a little, so we're gonna call it fair game here. Piece by Piece shows you how Pharrell feels about his music by using stunning Lego animations to represent his synesthesia. I particularly love the way that it represents Pharrell's beats as these abstract, glowing pieces of Lego. It's a really strong visual metaphor, especially when you take into account how beat making works. Pharrell's process is all about taking little snippets from other songs and remixing them, reshaping them into these new, vibrant little art objects. And that's exactly what the film does. Some biopics take things a step further, with the ethos of the music informing the story on a structural level. Bird is a 1988 biopic by Clint Eastwood about Charlie Parker. In its structure and editing, Bird feels like the manic, organized chaos of the bebop music that Parker invented. It jumps around a non-linear timeline, spiking with moments of raw emotional intensity in a way that really does feel like jazz. And by embodying Parker's music in its narrative and editing, Bird helps explore the tragedy of him as an artist. It's a film that pays less attention to reenacting the precise details of Bird's life and spends more time studying and celebrating the ways that his life is reflected in his singular, manic music. It really places you in the world that shaped Parker's music in a way that I think few biopics can do as successfully. One that I do think pulls it off, though, is Born to be Blue, Robert Boudreau's 2015 biopic on Chet Baker. In a 2015 review for Variety, Andrew Barker describes this film as treating Chet Baker's life as though it were merely a chord chart from which to launch an improvised set of new melodies. It explores Chet Baker not through the exact facts of his life, but through the way his sorrowful, melancholy music makes you feel. And just as Bird and Born to be Blue reflect the unique jazz stylings of their subjects, Weird, the Al Yankovic story, lives on as a film version of Weird Al's songs. Weird Al made a career on parodying the pop stars of his day, so it's kind of fitting that his biopic serves as a parody of the biopics that are also common now. But there's one biopic that goes above and beyond in celebrating music both visually and structurally. And yes, it is I'm Not There. We're talking about I'm Not There again. Really, I cannot stress enough how much I love this movie. I'm Not There finds every excuse it can to highlight Dylan's music. It uses original recordings of Dylan songs, it uses Dylan's instrumentals as the score, it features covers of Dylan songs both on camera as didactic sound and in the background as soundtrack. This movie absolutely breathes Dylan. It populates its story with characters and images that feel pulled from Dylan's lyrics. It embraces anachronism and surrealism just like so much of Dylan's work does. The Heath Ledger romance section feels spiritually inspired by Tangled Up in Blue, while Richard Gere's Western section clearly captures the strange, biblically apocalyptic vibes of John Wesley Harding. As much as I'm Not There works as an exploration of Dylan as a character, the entire movie also feels like it could be a Dylan song. And I think that's a pretty impressive feat. If you've made this far, you'll no doubt notice there's one key biopic I haven't mentioned yet. Honestly, there's probably a few. There's a whole list that I didn't get to because I couldn't easily get my hands on them, or because I was too busy reeling from watching chimp Robbie Williams murder himself in an apocalyptic metal showdown. But the one that you're all probably yelling about is Love and Mercy, and that one I have absolutely watched many times, so we're going to talk about it in this next section. People have always been fascinated by genius, especially in the creative realm. There's a mysticism to it, the way these artists can reach beyond the physical and tap into something that touches our collective unconscious, stirs emotions in us, and changes our perspectives on life. And this is something that many biopics make a nominal attempt at exploring, but far too often they fall flat. So many of these films seem to think creative genius comes from singular individuals who get sparks of inspiration from the heavens and rush to write down a classic song. The most common trope with this is that a film will depict something happening to an artist, and then it will cut immediately to them writing or recording a song about it.
You can't walk no line.
This promotes a pretty flat and linear worldview in which ideas just come to talented people who then sit down and make them a reality, often in defiance of the systems around them. But the reality of creative genius is seldom so simple. It's a process that is frequently drawn out and almost always collaborative. I think A Complete Unknown does a decent job at this. Throughout the entire film, Dylan is constantly seen working on songs, tweaking pieces, playing bits of songs as he's hanging around his apartment, and it does a good job of showing how he's absorbed the influence of a teeming folk scene around him, highlighting the music of Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Joan Baez in particular. On rare occasions, these films will actually go into the songwriting process. I don't think even Robbie Williams would call Robbie Williams a creative genius, but I do think there's a scene in Better Man where we actually get to see the collaborative process of writing something beautiful alongside Guy Chambers. It's a nice little peek into process and a surprisingly grounded moment for a pretty unhinged movie. Another one that I think shows the creative process well is Tick Tick Boom. Tick Tick Boom is kind of an auto-biopic, I guess. It's based on a musical that Jonathan Larson wrote about his life trying to break into the musical theater world. In it, we see Larson relentlessly pursuing his dream musical, a wild sci-fi dystopia called Superbia. We see round after round of Larson workshopping the piece, including getting key advice from Stephen Sondheim. We see him throw everything he has at this project, alienate his friends, put himself on the brink of poverty, and in the end, fail. He doesn't pull together his dream project with an astounding work of genius. Instead, Larson watches his life's work crumble to pieces in front of his eyes, and then reflects, reconciles with his friends, and starts to work on a project that reflects the struggles and experiences of the community around him. Rent. Bird takes a bit of a different approach to genius, showing the virtuosic playing talents of Charlie Parker, but also showing him as someone who thinks and speaks in ways that frequently baffle the people around him. Forrest Whitaker portrays Parker as a man that is truly tormented by the fact that few around him understand what he's doing. This is a bit of a trope when it comes to creative geniuses, but it's often based in reality, and I don't think any biopic has explored this nearly as well as Love and Mercy. As Elliot Roberts points out in his fantastic video on the film, Love and Mercy is an excellent depiction of the process of creative genius. The structure of Love and Mercy is quite different from your average biopic, which maybe shouldn't be a surprise, given that one of its screenwriters was also a co-writer on I'm Not There. The film cuts back and forth between two moments in Brian Wilson's life, when he was creating his masterpiece Pet Sounds and slipping into mental illness in the late 60s, and when his wife helped him escape the clutches of an abusive therapist in the 80s. These two eras weave together thematically, with the actions in the latter informing the choice of song drops in the former, and both working in concert to display the complexities of Brian Wilson's mind. Both sides are compelling stories, but the highlights of the movie definitely come from the early sections in which Paul Dano inhabits Wilson in his imperial phase. Here, Wilson's songwriting is not shown as a process of spontaneous inspiration, but rather as a grueling process of working and reworking songs until they sound just as Wilson hears them in his head. We see Brian Wilson as someone obsessed with music, taking close note of what his contemporaries, the Beatles, are doing, and thinking carefully about how he places every single note. And most importantly, we don't see him doing it alone. The film does express the real tensions between the other Beach Boys, especially Mike Love and Wilson, but they're not reduced to the trope of haters who just don't get the vision. Mike Love's essential role in developing Good Vibrations is shown on screen, and we also get a ton of screen time from the Wrecking Crew, the musicians who actually played on these works. Throughout the film, we see the tension that happens with creativity. We see musicians being worked hard and pushed to their brink. We see the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into a masterpiece, and we feel the immense satisfaction when a truly great song comes together. This sensation is augmented by an incredible score by Atticus Ross. When making it, Ross had access to master tapes of Beach Boys songs, so he pulled them apart and worked them into ambient, musique concrète-inspired atmospheres. These strange soundscapes place the viewer within Wilson's head, trying to catch the little glimpses of drifting harmony before they disappear. This tactic of exploring creative genius by putting the audience as close as possible to the mind of the artist is also applied in 32 short films about Glenn Gould. As the title would suggest, that film tells the story of visionary composer Glenn Gould in a series of short vignettes. Some are abstract or stylized and animated, others are documentary-style interviews, and others are more like a typical biopic. But even the more traditional fictionalizations are less interested in tying narrative together and more interested in examining what it's like to be in Gould's head. A short called Practice shows Gould reading a piece of sheet music before envisioning it in his mind, the camera's movements dancing along with the music. In the short Gould Meets Gould, we see two silhouetted versions of Gould interviewing each other, an imagined peek into his head to see how he explores and justifies things to himself. More than just placing ourselves close to the artist, we are literally placed inside the body of Glenn Gould in Diary of One Day, which shows X-rayed motions of piano playing, heartbeats, and breathing, all as records of his heart rates and medications flash on screen. 32 short films about Glenn Gould doesn't seek to give easy answers about the genius of its subject. It's content to give us tiny flashes, shards of insight that shed little bits of light, understanding that it will never truly be able to illuminate all there is to know about the man, or all there is to know about creative genius. We've talked about a lot of different purposes of the biopic here, but really I think the ultimate purpose for this kind of movie is the same as the ultimate purpose for any kind of art: to help us understand the human condition better. And I think the most successful biopics might just be the ones that do that. I'm Not There helps us understand the fragility and illusion of self, and the ways that we're all constructing our own identity every day. Love and Mercy helps us understand the work that goes into genius, and the way we're all ultimately chained to our minds, for better and for worse. Rocket Man helps us understand the essential importance of loving ourselves. And the Robbie Williams Chimp movie teaches us that sometimes, to find resolution in life, you need to face off against a haunted demon version of yourself wielding a comically large flail. When I set out on this project, I honestly expected it might wind up a lot more negative, because the field of music biopics does tend to look like a sea of mediocrity at first glance. But if you dig a little deeper, there are some really strong and interesting films out there. A lot of these are movies that play around with form, that find interesting ways to visually depict their subject, or that subvert and defy the typical expectations of a biopic. But really what I think separates the most successful from those that fall flat is purpose. Biopics that know and understand their purpose can really flourish, give us new insights on their subjects, and new insights on ourselves. And that's what makes them stand the test of time. Before we wrap this up, there's a few more biopics that I wanted to mention here that I couldn't really squeeze into the video. And these are just biopics that are kind of genuinely fucking insane. Biopics that make the Robbie Williams chimp movie feel grounded. The first of these is Superstar, the Karen Carpenter story, an experimental film made by a young Todd Haynes. This film depicts Carpenter's tragic story using Barbie dolls, a choice that makes clear statements about the commodification of pop stars. This sounds kind of stupid, but honestly, it's a shockingly powerful film. It's simultaneously funny and eerie, contrasting the perfect sheen of the Carpenter's public image with the tortured state of Karen Carpenter behind the scenes. It focuses in particular on her struggle with anorexia, which, again, the Barbie dolls make a great symbol for. Superstar also examines the way we treat celebrities and makes fantastic use of the uncanny valley to show the dehumanizing aspects of fame. Watching this, it's pretty easy to understand how Haynes would go on to direct I'm Not There. As strange as it is, I don't even think Superstar can compare to the surreal nightmare that is Listomania. Directed by Ken Russell, who also directed The Who's Tommy, Listomania is an unhinged, deeply anachronistic take on the life of Franz Liszt, using him as a bit of a metaphor to explore the rock star life of the 60s and 70s. It opens with Liszt, played by Roger Daltrey, having a naked duel with a French aristocrat, and only gets wilder from there. We see Rick Wakeman as Thor, and Ringo Starr as the Pope. There's a Richard Wagner vampire, a Frankenstein Hitler, and all sorts of crazy stuff. Honestly, it might be a stretch to even call this a biopic and not just a psychedelic fever dream, but I wanted to mention it anyways because I think people need to know about this insanity. And finally, we have a work that's just as experimental as Superstar or Listomania, but frankly, a bit more coherent and a bit more now. Pavements is a strange deconstruction of the biopic genre, mashing it together with all of the other ways that films will explore artists' lives and works. It features actual documentary portions along with concert footage, but also weaves in pieces of a Pavement-inspired jukebox musical and a mocking biopic that pokes fun at the self-seriousness of so many of these prestige projects. It's a really unique movie and a super fun watch. And if you want to check it out, you can do that with Mubi, the sponsor of today's video. Mubi is a curated streaming service that showcases great cinema from around the world. Its films are handpicked by curators that truly love film. And it's a great place to see films you might have a hard time seeing otherwise. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. So if you want to try it out, you can get 30 days of Mubi absolutely free at mubi.com/polyphonic. That's mubi.com/polyphonic for a whole month of great cinema for free. So check it out and watch Pavements. I'm sure you'll love it. And hey, thanks for watching. Oh.